Hello. I'm excited to continue our journey through the book of Acts together. The story of God's church is unfolding right in front of our eyes. There's a ton of action, so fasten your seatbelts as we continue. In Acts chapter 4, verses 29 through 30, the early church prayed for two things. One, the boldness to preach, and two, that the Lord would stretch out his hand for healing, signs, and wonders. And as we make our way through Acts chapter 5, we see God answering both of those prayers. We see God working mightily through the apostles as they preach to the masses and provide healing for the sick, lame, and demonically oppressed. But the star of the show in the book of Acts is none other than the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is God, possessing all of the attributes and authority of deity. The Spirit is co-equal with God the Father and God the Son. The Holy Spirit is not an it or an active force like Star Wars. So the Spirit possesses a personality and a will. And though God's people were facing adversity in the first century, the Holy Spirit came alongside them as a helper, a counselor, a comforter, an advocate, a defense attorney. One of the original words for the Holy Spirit in Greek is the word parakletos, which means to come alongside. And parakletos is a legal term in its origin. It's from parakletos that we get legal terms like paralegal. So in the book of Acts, we see God, the Holy Spirit, the parakletos, coming alongside the people of God. He is their defense. He is their counselor. He is their help. And regardless of what they faced, they now had the advantage. When they were opposed by the Roman government, they had the advantage. When they faced opposition from the Jewish authorities, they had the advantage. And when they faced off against Satan and his demons, they had the advantage. Because God, the Holy Spirit, is our defense, our counselor, our help. We always have the advantage. And though the early church was filled with ordinary people who lived ordinary lives, they were now doing extraordinary things because they were empowered by an extraordinary God. Let's look at Acts chapter 5, verse 12. The apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers used to meet together in Solomon's colonnade. Let's unpack this verse a little. What's going on here? Solomon's colonnade was a place that the early church would meet. Some translations call it Solomon's porch. Solomon's porch was a covered walkway on the east side of the temple in Jerusalem, and this provided a safe place for Christ's followers to gather. And it was at Solomon's porch that powerful sermons were preached, and many signs and wonders were performed. That subject of signs and wonders in the early church can be a difficult subject to wrestle down and find consensus on. But I want to give us a working definition of signs and wonders. Signs and wonders are events that involve the direct and powerful action of God, transcending ordinary laws of nature and defying common expectations of behavior. I'll say that one more time. Signs and wonders are events that involve direct and powerful action of God, transcending the ordinary laws of nature and defying common expectations of behavior. And the signs and wonders that we see in the New Testament were done by the power of God, with the intention of giving glory back to God. Signs and wonders such as miraculous healings of the sick, restoring the walking ability of a man who had been disabled since birth, were done to point people's attention back to Christ and to authenticate the validity of the gospel. This was real after all. Jesus did get up from the grave after all, and we now have evidence of this through the demonstration of God's power over both physical and spiritual realities. Demons trembled and diseases were overcome by the power of the Holy Spirit. The church had the advantage. So how did people respond to these signs and wonders? Well, some of the people marveled and were in awe of God, while others were outraged at the audacity of these apostles to preach this new message about Jesus Christ. Verses 13 through 16 says, no one else dared join them, even though they were highly regarded by the people. Most scholars believe this to mean no pretenders or half-hearted followers risked identification with the believers. Only those who were truly committed to the gospel would gather under the apostles' teaching. To be associated with them was a risky endeavor. Verse 14 continues, it says, nevertheless, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. As a result, people brought the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and mats so that at least Peter's shadow might fall on some of them as he passed by. Crowds gathered from towns around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those tormented by impure spirits, and all of them were healed. People by the thousands gathered to hear the gospel and to be healed, and the scriptures tell us that all of them were healed. Wow. How could anyone not be happy about that? Yet, quite a few people were not happy about that. Let's look at verses 17 and 18. Then the high priest and all his associates, who were members of the party of the Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. They arrested the apostles and put them in public jail. The religious leaders in Jerusalem were not happy about the apostles' preaching of the gospel, and they were not impressed by the healings. They were jealous, and they wanted the apostles out of the way. They wanted this movement to stop right now. So the apostles found themselves in prison, and the high priest is probably wiping his hands, thinking, job done, I showed them, let's send this crowd home. But what the high priest and his associates did not realize is that the apostles had the advantage. God was working alongside these people. The apostles were arrested that day. They were set free that night by an angel, and they were back at the temple preaching the gospel first thing the next morning. If you are the high priest, you're probably sound asleep, thinking that you got rid of those guys, only to wake up and hear the news that they're back on the street preaching that Jesus message again. So the apostles are summoned again, and they are brought before the high priest again. They are told to stop preaching, and they tell the authorities that they can't. So the high priest and his associates wanted the apostles dead. They wanted to kill them. But a wise man among them said this: therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go, for if their purpose or their activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourself fighting against God. So they gave the apostles a beating, and they let them go. But they kept on preaching the message. God was on their side. They had the advantage. And God's church still has the advantage today. The Holy Spirit is still working in and through his people today. Having the advantage does not mean that everything is going to go our way. Having the advantage does not mean that we won't die or be in prison. All of the apostles were eventually killed, and godly Christians are persecuted every day. But what we will see in the book of Acts is that the church is like a nail. The harder the devil hits it, the deeper it goes, and the stronger it becomes. The church survives and even thrives through persecution. We have the advantage. God has equipped and empowered his church with the Holy Spirit. We each have gifts that he has given us to use for his glory. And by the Spirit, we have power, we have purpose, and we have a plan. Let's continue to watch this plan unfold as we continue our journey through the book of Acts.